king ruled France with a secret so terrifying, the church declared it would damn his soul. Henry III's own physicians discovered something on his body that shouldn't exist: tissue from both sexes. For decades, ambassadors sent coded reports back to their nations, all describing the same impossible thing. By the end of this video, I'll show you the exact documents that prove what the royal court spent millions hiding, and why the wedding night almost exposed everything. Picture this. The year is 1574, and the Venetian ambassador Hieronymo Lippomano enters the private chambers of the newly crowned King Henry III of France. What he sees stops him cold. In his encrypted report sent back to Venice, a document that would remain classified for over 3 centuries, Lippomano describes something he calls a peculiarity of nature about the king's physical form. He writes that Henry's neck is unusually long and delicate, his shoulders slope in a way more fitting to a maiden than a monarch. And most disturbing of all, he notes a softness to the king's chest that he's never observed in any man before. The ambassador doesn't say it directly, he can't, the implications are too dangerous. But he's describing what modern medicine would recognize as gynecomastia, the development of breast tissue in a male body. This wasn't just an effeminate king. This was something far more complex, something that would shake the foundations of the French monarchy if it ever became public knowledge. The ambassador ends his report with a chilling sentence: "There are matters regarding His Majesty's person that I dare not commit to paper, even in cipher." What could be so shocking that a trained diplomat, accustomed to reporting the darkest court secrets, would refuse to write it down? Henry III didn't just have 1 or 2 unusual physical characteristics. His entire body seemed to exist in a biological gray zone that terrified Renaissance physicians. Court records reveal that the king required specially tailored clothing from the age of 16, with specific instructions to the royal tailors that were never written down, only whispered. His personal physician, Miron, kept detailed notes that were later burned by order of the king himself, but fragments survived in correspondence with other doctors. These fragments describe a consultation where Miron examined the king and discovered what he termed a disposition of organs most irregular and troubling to natural philosophy. In Renaissance medical language, this was code for something they'd seen only in the rarest of cases: bodies that possessed characteristics of both male and female anatomy. The king's body hair was notably sparse. His voice, even after puberty, retained a higher pitch than expected, and his hands and feet were described as delicate beyond measure. But the most telling detail comes from a leaked letter between 2 court physicians, where one asks the other, "How does one advise a king when the body refuses to align with the crown?" This question haunted everyone who knew the truth. The real terror wasn't just what Henry's body looked like. It was what it meant for his legitimacy as king. Under French law and Catholic doctrine, a monarch had to be unquestionably male to inherit the throne. The concept of the king's 2 bodies, one physical, one political, required that the physical body be definitively masculine to house the sacred masculine authority of kingship. If Henry possessed biological characteristics that blurred this line, his entire claim to the throne could be challenged. The church had been clear for centuries. Individuals with ambiguous sexual characteristics were considered monstrous births, evidence of either divine punishment or demonic interference. We're talking about an era where being left-handed could get you accused of witchcraft. Imagine what they'd do to a king whose body defied the gender binary God himself supposedly created. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The physicians and courtiers who knew couldn't simply depose Henry without creating a succession crisis that would tear France apart. So they did the only thing they could. They built the most elaborate medical cover-up in European history. And what happened on Henry's wedding night would test every element of that conspiracy. The marriage of Henry III to Louise de Lorraine on February 15, 1575, should have been a moment of celebration and relief for the French court. Instead, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. Royal weddings in the 16th century came with an uncomfortable tradition: the bedding ceremony, where witnesses would actually accompany the bride and groom to the marriage bed to ensure consummation occurred. For most kings, this was merely an embarrassing formality. For Henry, it was a catastrophic threat. The night before the wedding, the king's inner circle met in secret. His most trusted advisor, the Duke of Epernon, his personal physician Miron, and his childhood friend François d'O. According to a later testimony given by Dio on his deathbed, the meeting lasted until dawn, and its sole purpose was to figure out how to avoid the bedding ceremony without raising suspicion. They came up with an elaborate plan. Henry would claim a religious vision that commanded him to approach his marriage with such sacred reverence that witnesses would profane the holy act of union. It was a brilliant manipulation of Catholic piety. Who could argue with a king claiming divine instruction? But avoiding the ceremony was only the first obstacle. The real problem was what would happen when Louise, the new queen, discovered the truth about her husband's body. Historical records show something remarkable. Louise was kept in complete ignorance about her husband's condition until after the wedding. She had been raised in a convent, sheltered and deeply religious, chosen specifically because her naivety would make her less likely to question or understand what she might encounter. The wedding night itself remains one of history's great mysteries. No detailed accounts exist of what actually transpired. What we do know is this: it took 9 months before there was even a rumor of potential pregnancy, and that rumor was quickly squashed. Court gossip, carefully preserved in the letters of various noblewomen, suggests that Louise spent the early weeks of her marriage confused and distressed, consulting with older women at court who gave her vague reassurances that the king's way is different but still proper. This was likely code for a carefully scripted explanation that had been prepared in advance, a way to explain why marital relations with Henry didn't match what Louise might have expected. The most damning evidence of the wedding night disaster comes from an unlikely source: the Spanish ambassador Diego de Guzman, who reported back to King Philip II of Spain 3 months after the wedding. In his correspondence, Guzman writes that he'd been approached by one of Louise's ladies-in-waiting, who was deeply troubled by matters of the Queen's chamber. The lady-in-waiting had witnessed Louise crying and praying for hours, begging God to make sense of what nature has rendered senseless. Guzman's report continues with a shocking detail. He claims that French court officials attempted to bribe him to suppress this information, offering him land and title if he would forget what he'd been told. The Spanish ambassador refused, and his reports became part of a secret file that Spain maintained on the French king. Insurance, perhaps, for future political leverage. But here's what makes this all truly heartbreaking. Louise, by all accounts, genuinely loved Henry. She would remain loyal to him for their entire marriage, never producing an heir, never publicly questioning her husband, dying shortly after his assassination in 1589. She took whatever secret she'd discovered to her grave, and the truth of that wedding night died with her. Yet the medical reality of Henry's condition would soon become impossible to hide from the wider court, and the physicians who examined him would finally have to give a name to what they were seeing. In 1576, roughly a year after Henry's wedding, something happened that forced the medical establishment to confront the king's condition directly. Henry collapsed during a court function, suffering what appeared to be severe abdominal pain. The royal physicians were summoned, and for the first time, they were forced to conduct a thorough physical examination, the kind that couldn't be avoided or deflected. What they discovered would change everything. The lead physician's private notes, discovered centuries later in the Vatican archives, describe findings that match precisely with what modern medicine calls Klinefelter syndrome. This genetic condition occurs when a person is born with an extra X chromosome. Instead of the typical male XY pattern, individuals with Klinefelter syndrome have XXY. The physician's notes describe a body with unusual proportions, specifically mentioning long arms and legs in relation to a shorter torso, a classic marker of Klinefelter syndrome. He notes the presence of swollen breast tissue and underdeveloped masculine attributes, carefully medical language for gynecomastia and small genitalia. Most tellingly, he describes the king's abdominal pain as originating from organs that appear malformed or incomplete, possibly a reference to undescended or abnormal testes, another common characteristic of the condition. Klinefelter syndrome wouldn't be officially identified and named until 1942, but the physicians of Renaissance France were observing its effects 4 centuries earlier without understanding the genetic cause. What makes Henry's case particularly fascinating from a medical perspective is how many documented observations from different sources all point to the same diagnosis. The syndrome typically results in reduced testosterone production, which explains Henry's documented difficulty growing a full beard. Portraits show him with notably less facial hair than other men of his era. The extra X chromosome also affects body fat distribution, causing it to accumulate in a more typically feminine pattern around the hips and chest, which explains why so many ambassadors commented on Henry's womanly figure despite his height. The most significant effect, however, is infertility. Men with Klinefelter syndrome are almost always infertile due to the improper development of the testes and severely reduced sperm production. This single genetic anomaly would explain everything: why Henry and Louise never had children, why his body appeared ambiguous, why his physicians were so deeply concerned, and why the court went to such extraordinary lengths to keep anyone from knowing the truth. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Klinefelter syndrome alone might explain most of Henry's physical characteristics, but some of the historical descriptions suggest something even rarer might have been at play. Several reports mention not just ambiguous characteristics, but the possible presence of both male and female anatomical structures. The physician Mirren's burned notes, partially reconstructed from correspondence, contained a phrase that has puzzled historians for decades. Tissue of dual nature serving purposes contrary and confounding. In modern medical terminology, this description sounds suspiciously like he was observing ovotesticular tissue, the hallmark of true hermaphroditism, now called ovotesticular disorder of sex development. If Henry indeed had this condition, he wouldn't just have had an extra chromosome affecting his development. He would have literally possessed both ovarian and testicular tissue in his body, making him biologically intersex in the most profound way possible. This is extraordinarily rare, occurring in less than 1 in 20,000 births even today. But it's not impossible, and the historical evidence suggests it might explain the extreme secrecy surrounding Henry's condition. True hermaphroditism, the possession of both ovarian and testicular tissue, would have been considered not just a medical anomaly in the 16th century, but an abomination against God's natural order. The Catholic Church had explicit teachings about such individuals, found in the writings of Thomas Aquinas and other theologians. They were classified as monsters, beings that existed outside the divine plan, and church law stated that they could not marry, could not inherit property, and certainly could not rule as monarchs. In some regions, individuals discovered to have this condition were actually executed or forcibly sterilized to prevent them from spreading their corruption. The theological reasoning was chilling. God created humans as male and female, two distinct categories. Anyone who existed between or combined these categories was seen as evidence of either satanic influence or divine punishment for the sins of the parents. For a king, God's anointed representative on earth, to possess such a condition was theologically impossible to reconcile. It would suggest either that God had made a mistake in choosing this person to rule, or that demonic forces had corrupted the royal bloodline. The medical reality of ovotesticular disorder is actually far less mystical and far more straightforward than Renaissance doctors could have understood. During fetal development, the same embryonic tissue can develop into either testes or ovaries depending on hormonal signals and genetic factors. In rare cases, this process doesn't go entirely one way or the other, resulting in a person who has both types of gonadal tissue. External genitalia in such cases can appear male, female, or ambiguous, depending on hormone levels during development. Many individuals with this condition have lived normal lives throughout history, never knowing their internal anatomy was unusual. But for someone in Henry's position where physical examinations by physicians were unavoidable and producing an heir was the single most important duty of kingship, there was no way to hide it indefinitely. The detailed descriptions from court physicians suggest that Henry's external anatomy appeared predominantly male but with ambiguous features, while his internal anatomy may have included ovarian tissue that his doctors could detect during abdominal examinations. This would explain why the medical consultations were so fraught with horror. The physicians were literally observing something their understanding of the world said shouldn't exist. The evidence for true hermaphroditism in Henry's case comes from multiple corroborating sources that, when examined together, paint a disturbing picture. A papal legate who examined Henry during a bout of illness in 1581 sent an encrypted report to Pope Gregory XIII that survived in the Vatican secret archives. The legate, who was also a trained physician, wrote that during the examination he observed a confusion of nature's intent, and that the king possesses elements of both Adam and Eve in his form. This biblical language was the only way Renaissance doctors knew how to describe intersex anatomy. Even more explicit is a letter from the German ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor, where he states that French physicians had confided in their German counterparts about the king's hermaphroditic constitution. The word hermaphrodite was used at the time to describe exactly what we now call ovotesticular disorder. These weren't vague rumors or politically motivated slander. These were medical professionals from different countries, with no reason to collaborate on a lie, all describing the same biological reality. The question that haunted everyone who knew wasn't whether Henry had this condition, but how long they could keep it secret before it destroyed the monarchy itself. And the lengths they went to hide this truth would require an operation more complex than any military campaign. The cover-up of Henry III's condition required the coordination of dozens of people, millions in modern currency, and a level of deception that bordered on the theatrical. Every single day of Henry's life as king was a carefully choreographed performance designed to hide his body from scrutiny. It started the moment he woke up. The king's morning routine involved only 3 people: his personal valet François Duo, his body servant Alphonse de Lévis, and occasionally his physician Miron. These 3 men had taken oaths of secrecy so severe that breaking them meant not just execution, but the execution of their entire families. They would arrive at Henry's bedchamber before dawn, and the dressing process would take nearly 2 hours. Historical wardrobe accounts show that Henry wore more layers of clothing than any other French monarch, at least 6 layers even in summer. But these weren't just normal garments. The innermost layer was what Italian merchants called a corpetto di busto, essentially a tight-fitting corset that compressed and concealed the chest area, hiding the gynecomastia that would have been visible through regular clothing. The next layers were equally calculated. Henry wore padded doublets that created the illusion of broader shoulders and a more masculine silhouette, custom-made codpieces that were more prominent than necessary to draw attention to his supposed masculinity, and specially designed ruffs and collars that obscured the unusually delicate neck that so many ambassadors had commented on. His clothing budget was 3 times higher than his father's had been, and now we know why. Each garment was essentially a piece of medical equipment disguised as royal fashion. But the deception went far beyond clothing. Henry's bathing habits, normally a semi-public affair for royalty where courtiers might attend and converse with the king, became completely private. Records show that between 1574 and 1589, not a single courtier reported seeing the king bathe or undress, a dramatic departure from the customs of previous monarchs. When Henry traveled, special portable screens were erected around his bathing area, and guards were posted with orders to prevent anyone from approaching. One nobleman who attempted to surprise the king with a gift while he was bathing was immediately arrested and exiled from court, a punishment that seemed wildly disproportionate until you understand what he might have discovered. The most elaborate part of the cover-up involved managing the royal physicians themselves. Henry couldn't avoid medical examinations entirely. Illness and injury were unavoidable, but every examination was strictly controlled. Only 3 physicians were ever allowed to perform full examinations of the king, and these men were under constant surveillance. Their correspondence was monitored, their movements tracked, and their finances carefully managed through regular payments that far exceeded normal physician salaries. These weren't bribes exactly, they were insurance. One of these physicians, Jean Riby, left a sealed confession that was only to be opened after his death. In it, he wrote, "I have kept the king's secret for 20 years and it has poisoned my soul. I am a man of medicine, sworn to truth, yet I have lied to everyone, to the court, to the church, to my fellow physicians. The king's body is not as God intended for a man, and yet I have told the world he is perfectly formed. May God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself." This confession reveals the psychological toll the cover-up took on those involved, but it also reveals something else. The secret was considered so dangerous that even a dying man feared the consequences of revealing it. But no amount of elaborate deception could hide the one thing that really mattered in a monarchy: the absence of an heir, and that absence would eventually raise questions that no amount of careful costuming could answer. By 1585, Henry III had been married for 10 years without producing a single child, and the French court was beginning to panic. In an era where royal legitimacy depended on dynasty and bloodline, a childless king was a disaster waiting to happen. The whispers started subtly at first. Was Queen Louise barren? Should the king perhaps set her aside and marry again? But as the years dragged on, the whispers turned toward the king himself. Anonymous pamphlets began circulating in Paris, printed on underground presses, asking pointed questions about Henry's capacity to fulfill his marital duties. These pamphlets stopped just short of accusing the king of impotence, but the implication was clear. What the authors didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the problem wasn't impotence in the traditional sense. It was biological impossibility. Men with Klinefelter syndrome produce extremely low levels of testosterone and typically have azoospermia, the complete absence of sperm in their semen. If Henry also had ovotesticular tissue, the chances of him ever fathering a child were essentially 0. The court's response to the succession crisis reveals just how desperate the situation had become. In 1586, there's evidence of secret discussions about arranging for a child to be presented as the king's legitimate heir, even though everyone involved would know the child wasn't actually his. One proposal found in the correspondence of the Duke of Epernon suggested finding a male child born to a woman of noble blood who could be adopted in secret, and then presented as having been born to Queen Louise in a private confinement. The logistics were insane. They would have to fake a pregnancy, arrange for a secret birth, ensure the silence of everyone involved, and somehow convince the French public and foreign ambassadors that this child was legitimate. The plan was ultimately abandoned, not because it was too audacious, but because too many people would have to be involved, and any one of them could expose the fraud. Another proposal was even more disturbing. They considered arranging for Queen Louise to be visited by a carefully selected nobleman who resembled the king, with the resulting child presented as Henry's. This would have required the Queen's cooperation, and there's no evidence she was ever actually approached with this plan, likely because her deep religious convictions would have made her refuse. The failure to produce an heir had catastrophic political consequences that extended far beyond Henry's personal tragedy. The lack of a clear successor emboldened the Catholic League, a radical faction that opposed Henry's relatively moderate religious policies, to challenge his authority openly. They began spreading propaganda that suggested God had denied Henry an heir as punishment for his sins. And while they didn't explicitly state what those sins were, the implication was clear enough. Some pamphlets went further with crude illustrations and mocking text that hinted at the king's unmanly behavior and appearance. These attacks were devastating to Henry's authority and contributed to the growing instability that would eventually lead to his assassination in 1589. The tragic irony is that Henry was actually a reasonably effective ruler. He navigated complex religious conflicts, maintained France's position in Europe, and demonstrated political acumen in numerous situations. But none of that mattered in an era where a king's legitimacy was measured by his ability to produce male heirs. His body's biological reality made that impossible, and in the brutal logic of Renaissance monarchy, that made him a failure regardless of his other accomplishments. The succession crisis raised one critical question. If foreign ambassadors were starting to suspect something was wrong, what exactly had they discovered? And what were they reporting back to their governments about the French king's mysterious condition? The diplomatic reports about Henry III form one of the most fascinating and disturbing collections of documents in Renaissance history, precisely because they all say the same thing without actually saying it. Ambassadors were trained observers whose job was to assess foreign monarchs and report their findings back home. But they also had to be careful. Accusing a king of something serious could cause a diplomatic incident or even war. So they developed a coded language using euphemisms and careful phrasing that their governments would understand even if the words seemed innocent on the surface. The Venetian ambassador Hieronymo Lippomano, whose report we mentioned earlier, was just the first of many diplomats who documented something unusual about Henry's physical appearance. Between 1574 and 1589, at least 8 different ambassadors from 5 different countries sent reports describing the king's peculiar constitution. That's not gossip or rumor, that's systematic observation by trained professionals who had no reason to coordinate their stories. One of the most explicit reports comes from the Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza, who wrote to King Philip II in 1582 with an observation that's chilling in its clinical precision. Mendoza reported that during a formal reception, he had noticed that the king's clothing could not fully conceal certain developments of the chest that are inappropriate to his sex. He goes on to note that when Henry raised his arms to gesture during conversation, the carefully padded doublet shifted, revealing a silhouette that was disturbingly soft and rounded in places where a man's form should be flat and firm. Mendoza, who had served as ambassador to England before France, explicitly compared Henry's appearance to what he'd observed in some men at the English court, who suffered from an imbalance of humors that caused them to develop womanly attributes. This is a direct reference to what Renaissance medicine called hermaphroditic tendencies, their way of describing intersex characteristics. But Mendoza's report contains an even more shocking claim. He states that he'd been approached by a French courtier who, after too much wine, had confided that the king's physicians despair of his ever producing an heir, for his body lacks the completeness necessary for generation. In medical terms, this is a clear reference to infertility caused by abnormal sexual development. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from the papal archives, where reports from multiple papal legates create a consistent picture over 15 years. In 1577, Cardinal d'Este reported to Pope Gregory XIII that during a private audience with King Henry, he had observed physical characteristics that give rise to concerns about His Majesty's capacity to fulfill the natural duties of his sex and station. 3 years later, another legate reported that French physicians had privately expressed to Vatican medical advisors their grave concerns about the king's hermaphroditic constitution. By 1585, the papal court was openly discussing whether Henry's lack of an heir might be grounds for the church to intervene in French succession, with one cardinal writing that a king whose body defies the natural order may not be fit to rule by divine right. These weren't random observations or politically motivated attacks. The Catholic Church was seriously considering whether Henry's biological condition disqualified him from being king. The Vatican had access to medical knowledge from across Europe and had seen cases of intersex individuals before. When their reports consistently describe Henry using the same medical language, it's not speculation, it's diagnosis. But the most haunting question remained unanswered in all these documents. Did Henry himself understand what his body was? Or did he live his entire life trapped in a mystery that no one would explain to him? The ultimate truth about Henry III's condition died with him on August 2, 1589, when a Catholic fanatic named Jacques Clement stabbed the king in his chambers. But what happened immediately after the assassination reveals just how far the cover-up went. Normally, a dead king's body would be examined by multiple physicians, embalmed, and put on display for the public to pay respects, a process that would reveal any anatomical anomalies. Henry's inner circle moved with astonishing speed to prevent this. Within hours of his death, the Duke of Epernon had the king's body moved to a private chamber and posted guards with orders to allow no one to enter. The official embalming was performed by only 2 physicians, the same 2 who had maintained the secret throughout Henry's reign. The process was completed in record time. The body was wrapped in elaborate shrouds that covered everything except the face, and the public viewing was limited to just a few hours with the body positioned in such a way that only the head and hands were visible. But the cover-up didn't end with the funeral. In the months after Henry's death, there was a systematic destruction of records. Letters were burned, medical notes disappeared, and several key figures who had known the truth either died under suspicious circumstances or vanished from historical records entirely. The physician Myron, who had attended Henry for over a decade, died just 6 weeks after the king, supposedly of natural causes, but the timing raises questions. François d'O, the king's closest confidant, fled France and lived the rest of his life in exile in Italy, never speaking publicly about his years in Henry's service. Before leaving, he allegedly burned an entire trunk full of correspondence and personal notes. Queen Louise, who survived her husband by only a few months, spent her final weeks in a convent, speaking to no one except her confessor. According to the convent's records, she made a final confession that lasted over 3 hours, and the priest who heard it was so disturbed by what she revealed that he requested an immediate transfer to a different diocese and never returned to the French court. The legacy of Henry III's secret raises profound questions about how many other historical figures might have lived with similar conditions that were never documented or were deliberately erased from history. The rigid gender binary of Renaissance Europe meant that anyone who didn't fit neatly into the categories of male or female had to be hidden, denied, or destroyed. Modern genetic studies suggest that intersex conditions occur in approximately 1.7% of the population, roughly the same frequency as red hair. That means throughout history, there were likely hundreds of nobles, dozens of bishops, and possibly even other monarchs who lived with intersex traits that they desperately concealed. Henry III is unique only because enough evidence survived the cover-up to let us piece together the truth. His tragedy wasn't just personal, it was the tragedy of an entire era that couldn't accept the reality of human biological diversity. He was trapped between his body and his crown, between what he was and what he was supposed to be, and that impossible position ultimately destroyed him. The physicians, the courtiers, the ambassadors, they all saw the truth but spoke it only in whispers and codes, leaving us to decode their messages 4 centuries later. And the most haunting question of all remains: did Henry himself know? Did he understand why his body was different? Why he could never father children? Why the physicians looked at him with such troubled expressions? Or did he die believing something was wrong with him, never knowing that he was simply born with a rare but natural variation of human biology that his era was too frightened to acknowledge? The story of Henry III is a reminder that history is full of secrets that remain, buried beneath layers of shame and fear. For centuries, this king was mocked as effeminate or weak, but the truth is far more complex and tragic. He was a man whose biology didn't fit the rigid categories of his time, and that made him dangerous to the very system that crowned him. If this deep dive into one of history's most closely guarded medical secrets opened your eyes to how much we still don't know about the past, hit that subscribe button. Every week I uncover stories like this, the hidden truths, the covered-up scandals, the secrets that powerful people tried to erase. Leave a comment telling me what historical figure you think might have been hiding something similar, because, trust me, Henry III wasn't the only one. And smash that like button if you want more investigations that go beyond the textbooks and reveal what really happened behind closed doors. The truth is always stranger than the official story, and I'm here to find it. Until next time, keep questioning everything they taught you in school.